The creation of the five families changed the way organized crime operated in New York. These were no longer simply neighborhood gangs competing over a few streets. They had leadership structures, defined territories, and relationships that connected different parts of the city. The goal was not to eliminate competition completely. It was to control competition. Major criminal groups could negotiate disputes instead of constantly turning every disagreement into a new conflict. That stability allowed their organizations to survive changes in leadership and shifting political conditions. And as New York continued growing, their influence expanded beyond the neighborhoods where everything had started. Illegal gambling remained an important source of income, while labor racketeering and other criminal enterprises created additional opportunities. The money gave organized crime groups resources that small street gangs could never have imagined. But money alone did not create their influence. Connections mattered just as much. Some criminal organizations developed relationships with business figures, corrupt officials, and other powerful individuals. These connections could make investigations more difficult and allow criminal enterprises to operate for years without being completely dismantled. For ordinary New Yorkers, the mafia was often something they heard about indirectly. A name whispered in a neighborhood, a business suddenly changing hands, or a local figure everyone seemed to know but nobody wanted to discuss. The silence itself became part of the system. But federal investigators were not standing still. As organized crime became more sophisticated, law enforcement developed new methods to investigate criminal networks. Investigators began following financial records, gathering testimony, and building cases against senior members. One of the biggest challenges was proving that powerful leaders were responsible for crimes carried out by people beneath them. For decades, that made organized crime difficult to penetrate. Then federal prosecutors found a powerful legal tool. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, was passed in 1970. It allowed prosecutors to target criminal organizations as coordinated enterprises rather than focusing only on individual offenses. That changed the balance. Investigators could increasingly connect leaders to broader patterns of criminal activity. And for the mafia, the era of operating with relative freedom was beginning to close. By the 1980s and 1990s, the old mafia system was under growing pressure. Federal investigations became more aggressive. Informants became increasingly important. And longtime members began cooperating with authorities. For organizations built on secrecy and loyalty, cooperation from insiders created a serious problem. The walls that had protected the mafia for decades were becoming weaker. Major prosecutions followed. Senior figures were arrested and convicted, and the traditional power of the five families declined. The mafia did not disappear completely, but the world that had allowed it to flourish was changing. New York itself had changed. Law enforcement had changed, and the old methods of organized crime were becoming much harder to maintain. The story of Italian organized crime in New York is often remembered through movies, television, and famous characters. But the real history is much more complicated. Behind the legends were immigrant neighborhoods, struggling families, corrupt institutions, criminal enterprises, and decades of law enforcement investigations. And perhaps the most important lesson is that the mafia was never the story of Italian Americans as a whole. The vast majority of Italian immigrants came to America looking for exactly what generations of immigrants have always wanted: a safe home, a steady job, and a better future for their children. The mafia was created by a relatively small criminal minority operating within a much larger immigrant community. That distinction matters, because the history of Italian Americans in New York is ultimately much bigger than the history of organized crime. It is also a story of families building businesses, communities establishing themselves, and immigrants becoming part of the American experience. The mafia simply became one of the darkest chapters within that much larger story. And its rise began with small groups on the streets of New York. groups that slowly discovered something far more powerful than territory. They discovered how organization could turn scattered criminal activity into a system. And once that system existed, it would shape the history of New York for generations. By the middle of the 20th century, the Mafia had become deeply woven into New York's public imagination. Its names appeared in newspapers, courtrooms, police investigations, and eventually on movie screens around the world. But behind the headlines was a much less glamorous reality. Ordinary people lived and worked in neighborhoods where organized crime sometimes had influence. While law enforcement spent years trying to break those networks apart, some businesses became caught between criminal pressure and government investigations. Some witnesses remained silent for years, and some members eventually decided that loyalty was no longer worth the price. That slow breakdown would become one of the biggest turning points in the history of New York organized crime. By the late 20th century, the Mafia was facing a challenge it had never experienced on this scale. Technology was improving. Investigations were becoming more sophisticated. Financial records could be traced. And federal prosecutors were increasingly capable of connecting individual crimes to larger criminal organizations. The secrecy that had protected these groups for generations was becoming harder to maintain. Then came a new problem. People inside the organizations began cooperating with investigators. Once that happened, information that had remained hidden for decades could finally reach the courtroom. Powerful leaders could no longer assume that their inner circle would remain silent forever. The system was still there, but the foundation beneath it was weakening. And slowly, the era that had begun with immigrant neighborhoods and street gangs was coming to an end. It is easy to look back at mafia history and focus only on the famous names. But the deeper story begins with people whose names were never recorded in history books. Immigrants arriving in New York with almost nothing. Parents working long hours. Children growing up between two cultures. And families trying to create a future in a city they barely understood. The Mafia was never the story of Italian Americans as a whole. It was the story of a relatively small criminal minority that emerged within a much larger immigrant community. That distinction is important because the same neighborhoods associated with organized crime also produced generations of workers, business owners, artists, soldiers, teachers, and families who became part of American life. The history of Italian New York is therefore much bigger than the Mafia. But the Mafia remains an important chapter because it shows how quickly small criminal groups can change when money, opportunity, and organized power come together. It started with small gangs in New York. Prohibition brought money and power. Rival groups fought for control. Lucky Luciano helped create a more organized system. The five families became the face of the New York Mafia, and over the decades, law enforcement slowly weakened their influence, from small street gangs to a powerful criminal network. This is how the American Mafia began.